right, let's roll here, guys. Our today's guest is Joe Aurilia, the RevOps advisor and operator who works hands on with the B2B companies to diagnose and fix revenue execution problems that tooling alone can't solve. So I'm really excited about this conversation because I feel like I'm meeting another RevOps professional fellow, and we're going to have a great conversation. So it's really great to have you on.
Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so let's dive in. I want to learn more about how did you end up in RevOps in the first place, and what attracted you to this area.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like most things, you kind of fell into RevOps by accident. I actually learned I was doing it for over 8 years without realizing it, which I guess is kind of unique. Built a previous company that had focused on the client. We said, look, the client's very important. We're going to put them in the center. We want them to receive profitability. We want them to have a great experience. We're very technical. We don't like doing things twice. So how can we automate everything? So also Salesforce Architect built all that together. We built the whole company on that principle end to end. And then RevOps wasn't really a thing back then. It wasn't a term that we used. There was no marketing, no groups, no communities, no nothing. And then years later, I looked back and I was like, oh, wait, we actually did that and didn't even realize it. We just kind of used, core principles, and it happens to be what we now call RevOps. So it was kind of like an after the fact to say, yeah, we did RevOps, and now we do it in a more formal sense, but you kind of just kind of walked into it, so to speak.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, I think Ron and I were coming from a similar background. We spent a lot of time in finance, but often involved in the go to market conversations. All the quota setting, comp plans, etc. So we feel like you know, before the RevOps was a thing, like you mentioned, a lot of people were doing pieces and bits, and there was a lot of overlap until somebody figured out, hey, why don't we actually have a role that is called RevOps and is doing exactly that? So I can see how people realizing and discovering this after the fact.
Yeah, most things in operations is really about how do you kind of think about those the people, the process technology, the integrations, and how you do that in an orderly fashion to allow for reproducibility as well as scalability. So, when you think about those things over and over, we now have fancy terms for it, but it's kind of existed all along if you've really kind of dissected the way and the process by which you actually make business and revenue happen.
Yeah, that's what I think was missing back in the day, right? It was not driven like a top down with a clear connection to the objectives and having someone who was really connecting this between the all functions and the kind of pillars of the go to market in a more coordinated way, right? Everything was like, okay, you're in marketing, so you have a marketing operations person. You're in sales, you have a sales operations, and so on. But that was not really a thing. Connecting all of that, ensuring that you have a resources that are tied to the objectives.
And I do think the marriage of all those things into one umbrella really helps a lot of companies kind of brand the work those team members will do, because now they have sort of like a flag to raise, right? We are this team. This is our mandate in life. We are here to solve problems. I think it kind of helps clear away some of the, fear, uncertainty, and doubt around like their purpose in life.
Yeah, purpose in life. I love that. Uh, so let's go back to the moment where you realize that the tooling is not, a thing that is solving all these problems, right? You're describing this, okay, hey, well, let's go horizontally across the board between the functions. And we know that there's a lot of misconception out there in the market. Everybody wouldn't, there's a lot of people that think, okay, this is a RevOps, so they do tooling. Find me another tool. That's not what it's all about. When was the moment when you realized that that's actually a case and that there's something else that is driving the revenue operations success?
Yeah, I think, the first time we did it, again, we had built the company and, kind of realized later it was RevOps focused. I think when you built it with the purpose of being RevOps, and you start to think about how others are interacting with you in that mindset, you begin to think more deeply about what is the reason the team is here, what is the purpose, what kind of impact can they make, and a lot of folks came to the RevOps arena strictly from, let's say, oh, they were a CRM admin, or they were HubSpot or marketing or something else, and they kind of landed into the RevOps agenda. But that doesn't really answer the question of how they can make significant change, right? Rebranding without actual change doesn't really mean anything different. So when you think about how they can actually, force the revenue conversation in the company to be more streamlined, to be more profitable, to be more consistent amongst all the stakeholders, I think it's when you realize that is again, it's a people problem. And that's not a people problem, meaning, the people shouldn't be there. You should replace it with technology. It's the people are here, they're here to stay. That's a good thing. But how do we allow them to work better together? The tooling is really added on top of, once there's an agreement between the different stakeholders in the company on how they want to run the business, how they want to have the client conversation, how they want to go to market. The tooling then facilitates the repetition and the scalability of that decision making. But the tooling doesn't necessarily make the decision making for you. So I think when you start thinking about it more deeply, and you step away from like the initial interpretation, you realize that it's a much deeper thing. It's more about leadership. It's more about planning, more about strategy, and then the tooling kind of layers on top to facilitate that vision.
I think you mentioned something very important. You mentioned about forcing a conversation about revenue. How do you do this? Like how you typically approach this when you work with your current employer or you have previous experiences working with other companies? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think, there's a few ways I want to approach that. One is we often talk about individuals being stuck in their career, being unable to make things happen within the company. And people always say, well, you have to mention numbers, right? If you don't mention numbers, then executives are not going to look at it. And that has some validity to it. But when you think about it, every single function of the company has to deal with revenue. There's something that they're doing that affects, the ability for a company to sell and service their clients. And when you change a script in terms of that thinking, and when you make it kind of normal in a company to discuss the fact that this work effort has some, responsibility or change effect on the revenue conversation, not only do people tend to listen more, it's really just kind of allows you to kind of focus all your energy on the right things. So if you look at, hey, we're going to do this change, what happens? Okay, well, this change is good, but this change might increase churn, might upset the client engagement, might do this, might do that. You have to kind of think of things more holistically, and that's where I think pulling in the revenue element to the internal, operations pieces really helps kind of cross the chasm between what may have been in the past a back end function to what is now really more of a, forward facing unity type function.
Would you provoke the conversation in a more like a challenging way with the leaders that are leading the pillars and specific functions?
I think, I might garner some likes or dislikes in this one, but RevOps is still a little bit of the younger child in the group, right? And if I said sales, finance, CS, like it's the old kids, we already know what they do. It's not necessarily new. RevOps still be the younger child, so to speak. Sometimes you have to be a little bit, I don't want to say direct, but a little bit more clear on your intentions being not for the team, but for the company. And to let them know the reason that you're trying to have something done, the reason why you want to force a conversation is for the success of the entity. And sometimes that needs to be kind of forced a few more times to kind of get it across. What I see happen is that once you are able to prove wins to the company, things that have gone successfully because of the conversations, things that have gone to a direction of, more positivity, more revenue, more collaboration. I think those conversations become easier over time, which is why I think RevOps teams need to have a strong leader to stand in front of them to ensure that conversation at the table, to have the seat with the stakeholders, to ensure that the views are there, and it's not a last minute conversation. It's a we are part of the conversation together. It's not a, oh, you included us when something broke. No, no, we were here all along, and we're working together as partners.
I think it's extremely challenging. I don't know how you see this, but for me, it's challenge always to bring them in the room and having an honest conversation without trying to pull that planning cycle their own way, right? Or forecast, and etc. I I think there is a way to do this, and I agree with you that the best way is to show them how you can help them to achieve these goals. Because it's one thing to give somebody a target. Another one is just to give him a target and say, "Hey, this is how I see you can achieve this." So that's my technique, right? I don't know if you see this, if you practice the same thing or you see this to being useful. Because in the end, I think operations in any organization um, is about bridging the strategy with the execution, right? It's like this is the path that you take with the organization, and you tell them, "Hey guys, this is how we're going to achieve this." Right? If we want to do this, this, and that, this is what it takes. and you want to take it to a different direction, this is where we will take it, right? Um, I think the hitting on the positive note and helping them, I think that's part of the revenue operations as a function as well, right?
Yeah, I kind of consider a little bit of storytelling. You're doing a little bit of sales and marketing in that conversation. So you might know just by what you do from the operational perspective that this needs to be done. Like this is the right way, or this is what we're all going to agree on at the end. But it doesn't mean that you can do it right off the bat. You have to explain why you're going down that journey together. What is the benefit? What are they going to receive from it? What are the reasons we're going to do this? What are the goals we're going to obtain? And make everyone feel warm and comfortable. But change without warning is usually freaks some people out. But change that has a reason and that they're kind of emotionally bought into ahead of time, I think reduces a lot of that friction that can occur.
Yeah, I agree. But I also am in a position where I feel like the friction is part of the progress. Progress can be achieved without the friction. I think it's just almost like two forces that are just feeding each other. And in the revenue operations in general is that function that is always working on it. Um, because the confrontation, any of these targets, they will create a friction. If the company has a ambitious goal and is trying to get you 100% growth, that sounds ridiculous in a lot of these cases. But pretty sure that it's not exactly the expectation you're going to hit 100%. It's really about maximizing those resources you can get the closest to the pin. So you have to figure out how to do this, but it can be done without a confrontation because the resources are limited. So somebody will have to
Resource,
give.
yeah, resource always a challenge. I mean, I like to hope, maybe foolishly, the RevOps team's job is to reduce friction within the company while minimizing the confrontational friction required to get it done.
Yeah,
Ideally,
yeah, yeah. So I'm assuming you were in a lot of these conversations with the leadership. Um, in multiple places. But what is the most common illusion that leadership teams hold about the revenue and an ability to hit the targets?
I think, and this is I think something that kind of pervades a lot of different functions, a lot of different conversations, is that if someone says something is okay, then it is okay. If the chart says things are great, then it is great. I think an operator sort of aligned where, we question a lot of things. Like, that chart looks great, but what are the numbers underneath it? How do we get to this point? Someone says it's done. Okay, like, can we look at it? Can you show me it's done? Can we walk through how it's going to work? Can I play client? Walk me through how it's going to work. I'm going to buy your product or service. Take me in from the beginning. Walk me along this train. I think we don't often ask those next questions. We just kind of nod and say, "That's great, it's done." I think when you ask those next questions and say, "Take me along this journey, take me along this path," I think it's when you really can get things, ensure things are actually working correctly. And unfortunately, I think when you don't do that, we get a false sense of hope, and then we have missed targets, missed assumptions. Quarters go by, and we wonder, how do we get here? And sometimes we get here because we were afraid to ask those other questions.
Yeah, so that's a good point. There are always sometimes you're getting those false positives, and or you're getting a blip instead of a trend, and people just you know reading this. Oh, there's a trend. Oh, why we can't hit the Q1 this if we were Q4 that? That's a wrong assumption. I mean, first of all, anything that you're probably trying to predict within the 12 months performance is almost impossible statistically. Um, but there are some other nuances when you start digging deeper, like you said, and there's a dimension and criteria and things that just happened. Well, you start realizing you're not comparing oranges to oranges, right? You're ending up with a completely different readout.
Yeah, I mean, the data conversation is probably the hardest, right? How are you handling data in your entity? What's your data hygiene look like? Your strategy? What's your business intelligence look like? Do you have the same definition of various revenue metrics across the entire organization? Are you aligned on what that means? Have you changed your definition of an MQL 5 times in the year and then wonder why your data looks shoddy? I mean, these all affect, the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. Um, um, so when you first engage with the company, Um, what signals tell you whether the issue is strategy, execution, structure, or accountability? Is there anything that you using as a kind of signal detector in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say it's really fancy and this exact, 20-point chart you go down, but I think that's, maybe that's a different group. I like to start with a conversation. That's plain and simple. Let's just chat and tell me what's going on. I'm not coming with judgment. I'm not coming with emotion. I'm not coming with, I'm assuming you're doing something wrong. Just what's up? Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about it. I think in that conversation, naturally, you're uncovering. Um, Signs of misalignment, whether people are not communicating, whether information will not be flowing correctly, whether assumptions were made, okay, look, we just finished our product, on Tuesday and we released it on Wednesday and we're just curious why things are not going well. Okay, well, did you test it? Did you have any kind of, market analysis? Did you understand how you kind of positioning it? Are you really prepared to service this? Like all sorts of things. I think the natural conversation about the pain points a CEO or a team may be having kind of allows you to kind of dig into how they got there and surface those in that conversation. That could take you down the path of many different things. It might take you to one team or another team, might take you to an external service or a company structure or, a cultural issue. Um, I think the best thing is just not to presuppose an answer of what the problem is before you actually understand like what is going on. What have they tried? What have they not tried? Those are really critical inputs to understand how to help them.
Yeah, this is so true, and being able to manage a conversation that way and understand we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you ask the question, but then really listen for the response, is so critical, right? Especially early on when dealing with a new company or client.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the best things you could do is not say anything. Just listen. Just understand, feed it, and then let the answers kind of mature from there.
Yeah. So we talked earlier about kind of the watermelon effect, right? So something's green, but then you ask questions to uncover what's going on underneath. Um, I'd love to get a sense of, what some early warning signs are that indicate that, a revenue organization is maybe headed towards a miss, even though it's showing as green for a quarter, right?
I mean, I think so. One easy thing is, the temperature of conversation on meetings, pipeline reviews, forecasting, those type of deals. If you were just looking at slide decks and nodding and saying, yes, it's lovely. I love the graphics, great color matching. You're not really having a conversation. You have to ask, well, if it was that easy, then why are we even having this meeting? What's going on? So I think, a calm acceptance of what you're being presented without an active conversation is usually a sign that something is maybe not right. Also looking at, amount of conflicts in a conversation, right? If you are an enterprise side and you're having very long deal cycles, how many emails back and forth do you need to close a deal? How much redlining is going back and forth? How much negativity? How much changing at the last minute of a price in order to get a logo? All those things are signs that say maybe something wasn't communicated right from the start. Maybe we need to understand were they qualified correctly? Did we have the right enablement for the client? Did we go through the right conversation? Was the POC valid? Is the expectation there? Is the feature set matching? All those little things line up to, friction in that conversation that could have potentially been averted or looked at later on. So, and again, who owns that, right? Who owns that conversational intelligence across the entire sales cycle, right? That's not finance. That's not necessarily CS or sales. You need to, as a company, think about it and say, look, we want to do better. We're going to look at these signals across the entire enterprise. We're trying to understand, the health of these conversations. And then when we realize something is awry, try to actually reduce that friction and resolve it.
No, that makes sense. In fact, hearing you talk, we should change the name to Chief Question Officer, right? Because there's a lot of it is asking a lot of the right questions, right? To ensure that we can, kind of unwrap and uncover whether it really is green or whether something really is going well or whether, we need to change. And there's always room for improvement. But there's something about efficient, effective improvement, right? And focusing on what matters most right now.
It is too. I think, again, we're all dealing with people. So, when you say chief question officer, well, it has a nice ring to it. You know, people don't like people who only ask questions, right? So it's from a cultural issue type of deal. So I think it's fine to do that, but also you have to be able to show success in those questions, show money saved, go back to the revenue part, show happier clients, show problems being resolved, show teams being more productive together. So the questions are okay if they come with actual solutions, and it's not brought in as a this person knows better than that person type deal, right? It has to be brought into the context of, look, this is a question because I don't think we're going to meet our goal, right? I don't think that number is achievable, or I think our customer's going to churn if we do this. So if the questions are framed appropriately, I think it actually works out more advantageously for everybody.
It says so much about the culture of an environment you're into. Like, if someone feels comfortable enough to say what you just said after even before it's uncovered, right, or earlier on, that's actually obviously beneficial to the company. Oftentimes, people are almost afraid to admit that something will churn, a customer will churn, or that they're gonna miss their number, right? Maybe it's optimism, maybe it's fear.
I think certainly it also depends on, the role, the individual, the person. In my definition, a chief operating officer's responsibility is to make sure that the train, the tracks, maybe they don't always touch, right? We're not playing it safe all the time, but they're close enough where if they need to come home, they can. So we have to ask those questions for the betterment of the entire business to ensure that the machine is running properly.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned solving problems. So I'd love to get a sense of like where teams often maybe misdiagnose a problem. So and just go down that path, trying to fix that thing that maybe wasn't right. So whether it's sales skill, lead quality, pricing, or something else. So give me a sense of that and how you manage that.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen conversations where, the client is asking, let's say, for an apple, but the team thinks they actually want to go watch a movie. And, this is built up over weeks and weeks, conversations, meetings, emails, and now everyone's hostile and upset. So a new set of eyes comes into it. They go back and read the conversation. They realize, look, this is what the individual wanted all along. Like, if you just give them an apple, they walk away and they're happy. But we build upon a lack of clarity with all this other stuff, and it just creates a negative kind of situation for everybody. So sometimes just kind of peeling away all the information, just going back to what are we actually asking about? Are we even aware of what human A and human B wants to do? That can solve a lot of things. I had one particular instance where a client was dissatisfied with a particular legal agreement, and I realized that all they wanted after all weeks of conversation was to remove one single word. And if I removed one single word, they were entirely happy. And that was just something that wasn't uncovered. We uncovered it, removed a single word, they signed that day, everyone was pleased. So sometimes it's just the simplest things. You just need to kind of realize what the human is looking for.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when I hear that scenario there, you wonder how much that particular customer even knew removing that word would actually solve the problem. So it's almost like you uncovered that this is actually what the problem is, and then you remove the word saying this is what that word means in this context, and then you're able to solve it, right? So it still took the time. Maybe you could have cut some of that time out, but you needed that in order to show them what they maybe didn't recognize or know.
Yeah, but I think it really goes back to what you were saying earlier is that, that listening part is really key, right? Less talking and listening. What are we even talking about kind of deal.
Yeah. So earlier you talked about some tooling and when we talk about problem solving and all these things, oftentimes folks on the ground blame the tools. Right? It happens. We probably have all done it at some point. Some sort of tool we've used or app, we say that app sucks, right? For whatever reason, it happens. But how do you kind of distinguish between what is a real tooling gap and what is a processing gap, right? Or process gap?
Yeah, I love that one. So a little background is technically, officially, I'm a computer scientist. I used to be an enterprise architect, did lots of, technical work. So I was responsible for a lot of integrations in very large companies, M&A integrations, massive large scale systems. So, the technical part is really sort of, in the blood. So when you're looking at tools, yeah, some tools don't work, right? And we all wish we didn't purchase them, and that's mistakes we have to live with forever. But other times you realize it and say, look, the tool works, but I told it to do the wrong thing. It's like, saying I gave the AI a question, it gave me the wrong data. Well, did you give it the right prompt? So I think it requires an individual who not only understands what the tool's capabilities are, but then, as you're mentioning again, has the strength and the ability and the faith in the organization to say that, look, this particular tool isn't doing the wrong thing. It can do what you want. The thing is that what it's doing is what was asked for last quarter. And that's changed, and that's fine. But now that it's changed, we need to go modify some stuff. And that modification will require the following downstream effects. These integrations will be modified. These reports of data sets, these data have to be kind of, manipulated. It goes down to conversation again, right? So to blame the tool all the time, that could be an easy scapegoat, but sometimes it just really, revolves on what was asked. What did they misunderstand the requirements? Did you again say, did you do X? And they said yes. And you said great. And then you didn't look at it again for 2 months. And then you said, oh, it doesn't do what I want. So, maybe if you asked to see the demo or walk through it or see if it actually met your use case, that could have been resolved in the past.
Hmm. No, it's a great point. I mean, you see it with, kind of the quality of your prompt, for example, with AI determines the quality oftentimes of, the output, and you can apply that to a lot of different areas of life. Frankly, sometimes you're right, the tool is just not good. But oftentimes it's about, kind of what we're inputting, right?
Very true.
Yeah.
Yep. The human is still
Yeah.
responsible.
I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
randomness in picking tools as well, which is adding to the fire, right? You have a more often than not revenue operations under pressure just to implement something on the short notice because somebody told you this. That this tool is actually doing X, Y, Z, and then it's supposed to solve the problem, but it's creating four other problems. But you didn't have a time really to uncover that, and here you are, right? You're just ending up with a ton of shit that you have to fix because somebody wanted to have a you want to have a Christmas early, right? So I'm like, um, I've been in those situations, and usually you don't make a lot of friends when you say, like, "You hold your horses. I'm going to evaluate this, and I'm going to let you when we're going to implement this." That's not how you're making friends, anyways. But to your point, yeah, it's like it's an element of explanation, and talking to people. But we all know that there are some people that are so adamant about this, and they come in with a kind of top-down approach and trying to push you in and corner you until you agree. Um, so I'm finding that to be a difficult thing, and eventually, yeah, you have to just say no. As a leader, you have to be in a position.
Yeah, I mean, one way I've tried to mitigate that in the past was, for the entity as a whole, outside of just RevOps or any function, two specific things. One, do you have a documented procurement process, top down on exactly how you procure software and what kind of approvals are required to do that, what kind of testing, compliance, everything else. And then also do you have a very firm expense management process, not just for T&E, but also for, spend requests within the entity. So when you combine those two things, you actually have a very strong framework for what is allowed to be purchased in the company and what kind of checks it needs to pass to move that forward. In which case, it's not my team is being cranky deal. It's, well, the company policy for things across the entire enterprise is the following. And we're going to go through that. We're going to do a vetting of X applications. We're going to do a POC. We're going to ask these particular questions. I think it helps alleviate a little bit of the finger pointing. It doesn't solve everything. To your point, there will be individuals who force things, but it provides a little bit of some back cover.
Yeah, you're putting a little bit more guardrail around this. Like you just don't want this to be completely wild, right? And people going rogue. I agree with that. I was building in something similar fashion. The typical answer I have is just you know um, just let's go through our architecture because you as a leader you can definitely come up with something that is more a desired outcome in your systems architecture that is fitting the certain processes that you're building or you have, you don't have, and you have to develop. And then you know that you will need something in this space. It you might end up with nothing because the other tools maybe will cover, but you definitely know that there's some set of actions that need to be triggered and maintained or managed in that area. So that is usually helping because once people agree to the architecture, it's harder to disagree with this and say, "Hey, look, if you do this, you're gonna make a problem here, you're creating an issue here," and so on and so on. That was my approach. Along what you just said about having some guardrails around the kind of how you procure the new system. OneNote, there's more and more on average applications per organization than ever. So that is not just a minor problem.
It's a huge problem, not just from the fact of what you're paying for, just the context switching for the human brain about going through all these little red dots in the bottom of their laptops. I mean, it's quite frustrating.
Yeah, yeah. We probably need a new set of tools to help us to select tools.
More tools to manage your
Yeah,
tools.
exactly.
Yep.
It's like yes, yes.
Best way.
It's
That's the
more
best way. Add
salsa
more
on the
software.
salsa.
Uh,
Yeah,
y- you
you're gonna
you're making the end of quarter people really
yes, you're
happy.
gonna soon. You're gonna start eating, you know, not fries with salsa. You're gonna have a salsa with fries. That's what I'm saying.
All right, sounds fun.
Two good things. Two good things.
Um, yeah. So looking at this from the maybe market perspective and trends, here's what I have seen and observed recently. We have a lot of impatient investors, leaders, and for the same reason, I think the gap between the publicly traded companies and the startups is narrowing down in terms of pressure to deliver, at any given point. Um, and that creates an issue, especially with a privately held company, small startup or startup that is growing or scaling, because predictability in that environment is much less. Um, I would say achievable, or it requires a lot of additional effort. And needless to mention, the resources are not even comparable to the publicly traded company in most cases. Um, so, how do you navigate through this? You know, we want to look green. We want to look like we hitting all the metrics, and then the next quarter we go down, and then there's a pressure. Well, we have to come back, and in my opinion, a lot of these situations are creating the short-term strategies or tactics, not even strategy, tactics, and some operational tweaks that are not really helping the company to sustain the growth that they need in the long run to survive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to me the analogy I usually use that if you take like a round table that you're sitting at, there's that little hole in the center that the umbrella goes into. That little hole is the unique idea your company has. That's what makes you special. The rest of the table, which is, essentially the majority of the table, all the things you need to do just to stay alive. So, we've created businesses these days where, our unique thing gets squashed down to this very small component. But we need all these other things around it in order to be compliant, secure, have the right culture. So, as you mentioned, to deliver at any point requires all of those things to be up, running, alive, monitored, tweaked. It's expensive, it's arduous, it's a lot to keep track of. So, the snake gets bigger to feed, the machine every day. I think, trying to understand what the definition of good looks like for your company is sort of the key. Not every company can be the same. The automation and the type of capability, a public company has is gonna be different than a startup company. So what is good where you are? What is realistic for you to actually move forward with, and making that the best you can be. And then at least you have a clean set of process, a clean set of operations. And ideally, you kind of grow and scale that as you move forward. But all that said, you also can't think about it in terms of, okay, we do all these things to be compliant, secure, and to check all the boxes. You can't forget about your core product, right? That little thing in the center is still the only reason you're alive. And if you don't care for that little thing, you might as well go home. So, sometimes people think about all the process around the little thing. We forget about the reason we actually are here in the first place. And that's unfortunately a problem.
I love that. I compare this to the basketball season. I often talk to my customers and I say, "Hey, look, are you trying to win one game out of the season, or are you planning to build a team that can win most of the games throughout the season? Get to the playoffs, find the rhythm, have the chemistry, and achieve the goal." And I think in a lot of these cases, people don't see this that way. They are driven by the the need to impress someone. It might be investor, it might be someone in the board, it might be someone, right? Of course, they're chasing those things, and I can't blame them. That's a really tough job, by the way. So I'm not trying to belittle the 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 burden that they carry, and they have to be on top of a lot of these things. But at the same time, they can't forget that the achievements are not done overnight. You when you're building an organization, you're building a team, that's something that is going beyond that first game, a second game, a third game, and so on, right? Sometimes it takes years to build that very good basketball team. Um, so that's my analogy that I'm using, sharing with the customers, and sometimes they're just forgetting about that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Also, kind of goes down to, can your team go to the playoffs? Do you even have the right team? Do you have the right? Are you in the right game? Did you show up at the wrong stadium? Which are really tough questions to ask. You might be in the game, but you might be playing the wrong sport. Maybe you're playing tennis and you really should be playing badminton. You have to figure it out.
It's something though that to keep focused on that mission. Right, so in Dimitri's example, it was the championship. In yours, it's the center circle of the table, which, by the way, I'll never look at a round table again the same. Like, I'm definitely gonna think about, like, "Okay, what am I trying to achieve now?" So, as I reach for whatever food item is on there, but no, I love it, but ultimately, though, you're mission driven, you're focused on what matters. You said it earlier in the conversation when you talked about, hey, we're all trying to grow revenue for whatever purpose it is, but we're trying to grow the business. So not losing sight of that is so important.
It is, and I'll add in a little table fact for you just for fun here. I'm told the reason Starbucks is round tables is that when you're sitting by yourself on a round table, you don't feel so lonely. If you sit by yourself on a square table, you feel like you're missing three friends. But on a round table, you feel like you're okay.
I did not know that, but I've never felt lonely at a round table. So
And it worked.
Well,
it worked.
we just got a
Wow.
geometry class right now from Joe. Like, it's
I need a new
so
desk. My
I
desk, I feel very
appreciate,
lonely.
that, okay. It was
Ron's restaurant experience is going to be totally
So
different ever since this
it's
call.
totally different.
it was a while,
Never the
a while
same.
ago. Appreciate that. Squares, circles. Okay,
That's
all right, we
awesome.
got this. So, here's what I see also in the market. This, of course, AI changed a lot of things, and people are just freaking out. They're crazy about the productivity. I don't think we know where the buck stops on this one. And as we do that, I'm actually I started to be concerned about accountability, because it's really easy to start blaming people for not being able to achieve things. Having these wonderful tools, and being surrounded by this artificial intelligence that should make you, almost like a smartest person on earth. Um, First of all, I want to hear your opinion, how you see the accountability being enforced, from the RevOps leader towards the functional leaders, as a partner, and also how the AI will change this, or should change this. Maybe it shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, from an accountability point of view, I think, those small wins are really key. So especially if a RevOps team is recently made or there's some kind of major changes inside of it, is proving to the other stakeholders that you are there to support the revenue conversation, to support the individual functions, and to make the business more successful. So those don't have to be gigantic, massive things that you've done. It could be little things that were just kind of a really big pain for everybody for the last few years that no one in the world wants to touch because no one owns it. RevOps can go in and say, you know what, we don't have commission, we don't own marketing, we don't own budget. We're going to just fix stuff. And that's our job in life. We want to fix stuff. And it makes people happy. So I think, accountability goes into, did you make me happy? Did you make my life easier? Did you make me win more business? And I think RevOps, can do that and to have it there. On the AI part, it's interesting. Some of us play around with it more than others. So there's obviously differences in terms of education. But you really do need to have this kind of core understanding of what it means to use it in the appropriate way. Now, coming from a computer science background, I understand it's a machine. I understand we built it. I understand, who's the boss in the situation. And I know what to ask it and how to get stuff back. But if you have other individuals who don't have the kind of mentality for it, you really need to have some decent education. It's okay. This is how you communicate. I don't just mean prompt design, but what are the expectations? What to believe, what not to believe. So take apart, all the fancy words we use, hallucination, prompt design, prompt engineering, just in terms of communication. the human still needs to be the driver in the seat. It's basically going to, a super fast Britannica and getting all the information in the world and trying to resolve it really fast. But the information still may not solve what you want to solve. But that's your call. You need to make that. So, going even past just, raw copy paste, but, using it to answer questions faster than you could beforehand, to find information, to research, but then you still got to make that decision. So if you pass across that information as yours and it's wrong, you are still accountable for that because that was your decision. We can't say that was an AI decision. You decided to put that forward as Nancy's work, as Bob's work. So that's what I think makes it a little bit different. From the RevOps side with the AI integration, it's really a question of where does it fit best. So just because a tool says, "Hey, I'm this new fancy AI tool, you should use me," does that mean we throw out all the tools? Does that mean we have no automation today? I mean, for example, I'm a Salesforce person. We have tons of automation in sales, right? There's flows, there's processes, there's all these sorts of things. So it's not like we're without automation. This is just another level of automation. So really the question for me is not wholesale replacement. It's where can we inject this additional capability into our processes to make it even better and to do it in a responsible way.
Yeah, I think you nail it. I think it goes back to what we said about building a process before we get into tools. Because if you have a bulletproof process, which we know is never 100%, right? There's always change, and the company's changing, product is getting changed. There'll be always some changes. But I think you can be 70%, you know, change, and you can be 20% change, right? And that's a huge difference when it comes to the systems. Um, but what I'm trying to say is that if you are not having a right process in place, I think you're gonna end up with a completely effed up systems architecture that you will constantly replace, and you will never achieve what you're aiming at. And with the AI, that will be even worse because each of these tools will have their own AI that is operating off their own framework, and that often is conflicting with what other source system is offering, but most importantly, it was conflicting with what you're trying to achieve. So the orchestration can be only achieved if you have a very well synthesized process. If that's not in place, you have a problem. That's even more acute problem than you had 10 years ago.
I entirely agree. The technical term we used is GIGO. So garbage in, garbage out. So if you feed the AI garbage, what do you expect to get? A magical cake. So for me, the premises or the foundational framework to make the AI successful is somewhat of an excellent set of data hygiene as well as the ability for the humans in the room to explain the process to themselves. So if you and I are working together, can we explain to each other the process we're going to follow to do whatever we're going to do? If you and I cannot explain it to each other, how are we going to assume the AI is going to automate that? Now, maybe the AI can help us understand the process. We can build a process together with the AI and then agree to it. But to assume we're going to automate poor data with poor processes and come out with a magical, operation, it gets into trouble. So if you look at sort of, failure rates for AI injection into companies and products or services that have been successful or unsuccessful, a lot of times the unsuccessful rates are essentially because it started with a bad premise. It started with, unclean data sets, lack of a process understanding, no re-engineering done beforehand. And the expectation, as you said, doesn't come out to something that is achievable.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into another question we have for you, and also maybe not so equally, but certainly a sexy topic. Forecasting, right? Which is definitely a place where we've probably all spent a lot of time, and also felt like everything was great going into it, and then came out in the end and like, what happened, right? So can you talk to us about like how maybe forecasting can break in practice? And then, from your perspective, why is it still hard, right? Even when the data is right.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the whole, I guess, chief questioner name you gave beforehand. Y- You know, if you think about who usually works on forecast, right? We're talking about your, your CEO, your finance team, CS, sales, marketing. They're really in the room trying to have the conversation. As you're mentioning, is the data right? Is the big question. So forecast can be based on assumption of resources, assumption of product features, assumption of upgrades and modifications that might occur. If we hand wave over all those foundational elements of our decision making, and they turn out to not be true, why should we sit here and wonder why the forecast, was not correct? So if you're going to build a forecast, you're going to base the entire business on it. If you really want it to be successful, then all of the information you fed into the forecast, just like feeding information into an AI, if you fed it in information that you cannot, on a stack of Bibles, say is actually correct and working, then you're going to have shoddy data, which is the unfortunate part. So, looking at a business, assuming, look, we assume we're going to create these features this year. We assume we're going to have these automations. We assume we're going to be able to ship at a lower cost per product, or our hyperscaler costs are going to be reduced by a third. If those are not backed by real math, real data, and real plans, and when I say real plans, we're making a modification in the system. Do we have a date it's gonna happen? Is that first quarter, second quarter, third quarter? Do we have the resources to do that? Do we have the growth money to do that? If we have some change we're basing the entire year on, but that change doesn't occur until the fourth quarter, how can we expect the year to be any different? 'Cause we're already done, right? So I think the data, the expectations, the reality of it, and then lining up those changes with the quarters in which they occur, and then how long it actually takes to generate a sale after that. Not every sale is simple. We're not all selling a reusable service that's very easy to consume. Some things are much more enterprise. I think all that thought needs to be baked into it to understand, is this really a reality? Is this really achievable from all the different elements? And in my definition, that's harder to do. That takes longer. It's more arduous. It also requires the individuals at the table to be way more honest with each other than they merely might want to be. Because to do that, you have to be willing to say, look, my department can't do it. I know you want me to do it, but I can't do it for these reasons. And that vulnerability may not always be accepted, but typically you can just say, sure, we'll have it. And then it'll be 8 months before you actually have to prove it.
Yeah, it's a great point. As you're talking, I'm thinking about like how that problem is maybe different depending on you mentioned the sales cycle or the size of your company, right? Like oftentimes you're just getting started, you're a seed company, and you're throwing grass in the wind and really just hoping it sticks at first, right? Versus someone or a company that's a little more mature, and you'd hope they'd have that right, but frankly, they're still acting as if they're smaller, right? And still throwing the grass in the wind to kind of make something up and hope it happens.
And as I love the fact you said that, when you're, at that seed stage and you're very, very young, you might do forecasting, but you all know, like this is something we have there, but it's really hard to know. We haven't even sold yet. How can we make up this number? But as you get more mature, as you get to your later stages of funding, as you get to more years, your shortcuts, so to speak, now have real consequences on the lives of every single employee in your company. So the ramifications are much more than just annoying the board or lacking financing or, messing up a board deck, wherever it is. You might be risking the livelihood of all of your employees. So there's really a lot more weight on your head to get it right.
Yeah. Yeah, so true. So, one of the other things I wanted to ask about is metrics, right? So talk about forecasting, then you get into metrics, and oftentimes we can focus as companies on the wrong things, right? And then the right things are there's a long list of them, and so you need to narrow that down, right, to make sure you're really leaning into what matters. So tell me a little bit about how you really make sure you're focused on the right metrics, and the right blend of leading indicators versus lagging indicators.
Yeah, I think I'll start with two, the metric conversation, similar to anything, even in the same vein, KPIs, goals, OKRs. It really depends on the stage of the company that you're at, whether or not even creating these things is a useful spend of your time based on, where you are from a maturity point of view. I think when you've reached a point where there's value in creating these particular numbers, you know, having all the numbers in the world may not really be beneficial. But what are the numbers, the metrics, the key points that drive the business? What are the things where if you mess up, you're gonna have a really bad Christmas, a really bad end of your year. So that way, not only do you have something to really focus on, but the whole company knows what the goals are. It's very clear. We all know our five North Stars. We all know what we really need to do to be successful. Whether it's closing deals faster, having a higher ASP, whatever happens to be, what are those important things? I think the other thing is, which seems common sense to a point, but not always, is if we're going to have these for the year, what's the best time to figure these out? Is it maybe before January or maybe something in the March, April timeframe? In my opinion, if you haven't figured out the goals for the year and it's like March or April, you've already kind of killed half the year. You're kind of done. So as an executive team, can we get that stuff together early enough so when we start that year or even before the year, people know going in, it's 2026. This is what we have to do. We're going to rock this thing. We have it. This is what we're aiming for. So it's not only creating the metrics that are important to you, it's a whole people and communication strategies that people understand. Look, these aren't things we just made up on the whim because we had to have metrics. We made up for a particular reason. We're committed to it. This is our plan for the year. And we want to show you all why this is what we're striving towards. I think that is what really changes the conversation.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? Having an executive conversation as your company grows, aligning on what matters, and then aligning on the metrics that are connected to that are great. But if you don't have the right conversations further down the organization, it was just a good meeting, right? Which happens often, right? It's a very expensive meeting with great slides often, right? But you're right, it has to be adopted further down the organization to really stick.
Yeah, and going back to what you said before, and when you're advising or having conversations with individuals and you're asking these questions. So tell me, do you have any metrics? Tell me how you do forecasting. Tell me when you do these things. Their answers essentially write the script for what you just said. When they tell you how they created those numbers, how they communicated it, whether or not it was, gone over in a certain cadence, whether or not they really met those numbers and, were able to follow up on it. All those things kind of drive the answers about where they may be in their current situation. So it's all just conversation at that point.
Yeah, it's a great point. Go ahead, D.
There's a lot of conversations about the metrics, but I think also that a lot of these organizations, they simply overkill. They do overkill around the metrics. Um, and the reason why is it's a combination of lack of experience. Sometimes you have the founders that are just first time founders. Y you know, they of course, they have a big ego, and they just wanna ensure, "Okay, look, this is how we should be measuring." Well, yeah, it makes sense, but, that's not how you grow, how you scale. And also, you at some point, you're gonna be in the room with your investors on the board. You better have something that you can share, because that can overshadow all your product successes, right? Or inhibit you in general. Um, but I think that there's also something about prior experiences. I'm always trying to educate my clients, telling them that they should approach this exercise in a very different way than they used to. All of us worked somewhere. All of us had some experiences, and a lot of us just coming and saying, "Hey, this is how I was doing this at this company or that company." I mean, I'm not trying to disregard that, but keep in mind that this company has a number one different product, operates in a different market, has a different buying persona, has a different ICP, and that's already enough to be open to other approaches. So I I'm finding this more often than not to be a case. And just because you were using a pair of shoes in the one setting doesn't mean that you can use them in the other. And for the same reason, you will have a different input and output metrics. So that means that you're going to have a new system.
It's very true. Plus, when you're looking online, you're doing research about what other metrics you should use, this or that. How often do you see that blog post or that conversation framed and first analyzing the situation those metrics would be utilized? Right? We talk about one of the most popular metrics, what people do, what people don't do. We don't often talk about, is this right for you? Is this the right place you should be in? That's the very key thing. Imagine looking at, iPhone production, right? You can have metrics totally different than a SaaS company, right? You're looking at manufacturing, looking at quality control. Everyone has to be customized to where you are, what you're doing, and where you're trying to go.
Agreed.
Yeah. Yep, definitely. So I know we're getting close to time. I do. There's some more questions we definitely love to ask. One is around kind of that chief revenue officer role. Um, how do you see that evolving? You said it was newer, right? So kind of the newer, role now within kind of sales and marketing and finance process. But how do you see that evolving and the RevOps leader as well, evolving over the next few years? And then the second part of that would be kind of what separates the good ones, the good leaders, the good RevOps leaders, CROs from maybe those that are average.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly on the RevOps side, it's much of a newer role, obviously, than your CRO, your head salesperson, whatever name we give them at that time. On the RevOps side, I'll take that one first. I think as we gain maturity in terms of what the function is designed for, and we gain additional leadership behind it, I think the potential can be greater when we move from tool facilitators and integration experts into strategic decision makers, seats at the table, driving the revenue conversation. I think that makes a lot of difference in terms of where they can go. It is interesting, when you're looking at RevOps roles, the titles are all different. We're all over the place with titles. We don't really have an exact hierarchy yet. The role itself tops out at a certain point. There's no like C-level RevOps person, so to speak. Does it belong underneath your CRO? Does it belong underneath your COO? Where does RevOps actually live from a stacking point of view? I think that still hasn't really been found yet. When you look at the CRO part, sales by itself, obviously we all know what that is for obviously, the many hundreds of years we've moved on that. But sales is much different now in terms of all the other things that relies on the integration with stakeholders, the back and forth, especially in a complex sales cycle or more enterprise sales cycles or long deal lengths or recurring revenue that has lots of loops inside of it. So to me, I think the differentiator is going to be individuals who within them are collaborating with people, not just because it's needed to get the job done, but because they understand it, right? The any kind of negativity shields are reduced. Any kind of commission only conversations are reduced. It's really in terms of, my title, your title, it doesn't matter, they're different. It doesn't matter we're on different teams. We're all working together on one team to solve this thing and move it forward. So I think when those conversations come in and you're just there to solve problems, I think the best relationships happen. So for me, I think as an operator, we're friendly with everybody, right? We're having conversations with sales, with marketing, with finance. We're there to build trust together. I think when any executive comes in that same position, to be open to ensuring that we're all communicating to drive the business forward, irrespective of our own domain. We don't come into the conversation and say, "Look, I'm here to protect sales. I'm here to protect operations. I'm here to protect finance." Where we come into the conversation saying, "I'm here to help achieve this company goal together," and we leave our exact hats, at the door.
Yeah, I agree 100% on this. I think, what I found is that operations leaders, they are less territorial than the other functional leaders.
We
And
have to be.
right, exactly, because that has to be in our nature because we working on kind of on the back end and ensuring that, the logistics are working. I was making this comparison that somebody told me about the army. So the strategy is for, amateurs and logistics is for professionals in army because, nothing will work without the logistics. And the operations is almost in a company is equivalent of the logistics. You're ensuring everything is working. You're ensuring that thing that you have a connected dots, et cetera, et cetera. So for the same reason, we are less territorial than they are. I mean, I'm not trying to put the too much characteristics around that, but I think it's coming out of this nature of the work, like you mentioned. You have to talk to everybody, legal, finance, everybody, and you're changing the hat probably several times a day in that regard, right?
Yeah, I do think as we have, more conversations like this, we have more networking, we have more communities around the revenue conversation. I think there's a lot of coalescing between the roles where we all realize, we're working together. So I think that conversation being more open now helps us get closer to that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Um, so let's move to the kudos and some industry around here. So I want to ask you, like, which two SaaS or go to market companies are you excited about right now, and why?
Ooh. Um, yeah, I guess maybe more trend wise, I think, there's a lot of movement on, lightweight CRMs and a lot of movement on, FinOps, which is obviously a usually unloved area, similar to like, HR ops or legal ops. We don't get a lot of love in that area. Um, On the lightweight CRM side, I think it's interesting, not necessarily for enterprise sales, but for those who are just getting started to create that formality a lot faster, right? So if you go back to the table analogy, they can create a lot of that base foundation without having to worry too much. We're all gonna have to wonder in 10 years as these companies mature, how they migrate. If the base application doesn't, accelerate its feature set, that's a problem, I guess, for the future. But it lets people get a great solid foundation quicker, which I think is really important to get, businesses off the ground. And on the FinOps side, obviously, there used to be, a very small number of very strong individuals in that area. I think the opening of the industry to a lot of change, to create that integration, create that openness, to create more attractive UIs, to create the understanding that integrations and handoffs are really key to allow things to communicate faster and to get, the numbers faster. I think that's a great boon for the industry, not only just from the fact of perhaps tooling that will allow for the business to move faster, but also just to have the data at a quicker point in time, right? To be able to, ensure that those finance numbers aren't hidden things, hidden in a labyrinth somewhere. They're actually things that can be discussed often because without the numbers, like the business can't run, right? It's all at the end of the day, it is kind of numbers. So if we don't hide those numbers, there's more of an opportunity to discuss the numbers.
Another good point. I agree with everything you said. Um, the transparency sometimes is a problem, and that's what is inhibiting the collaboration as well. So bringing that in any form, I think is helping organizations to move forward, and also save some resources. I've seen so many dumb decisions that because of that, the teams who didn't want to share, and they ended up in a kind of hiring extra headcounts. I'm like, that's the dumbest decision you could ever make. We could have a few engineers that build helping to build us the better product. Um, uh, Another question I have for you: everybody has their like beloved resources, right? And any book, framework, podcast that you would recommend to CROs and revenue operations professionals to follow?
I gotta say this podcast, right?
Oh my God, that was a spot on. That's why I asked this question. That's why this
It's
question is
awesome.
is on my
That
list.
is why it's there. Love
Okay, so we can close this one. Okay, can you repeat this?
Repeat that.
Yes.
The Rocket Genius AI podcast. I
There
think
you
that's
go.
probably
There
the
you
one you got to
go.
check
There
out,
you
right?
go.
Okay. Okay.
You
Yeah.
have a
Now,
tattoo?
now I
You
get the
do you
free
have a
T-shirt.
tattoo too?
I don't. No, no. But
I'll send you the form. I'll send you my tattoos too.
thank you. It's very very kind. I'll sit at my round Starbucks table and have a conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll be there by
man,
myself. There
ink is trendy, man.
there it is. There it is.
That's what I heard.
Awesome.
Seriously, that was a serious question.
Is it- okay. Okay. Well, I, I thought you wanted to leave it at that. No, I mean, for me, for me, I've learned that dabbling, like sprinkling knowledge across places, has been the most beneficial. So I got very heavy into communities a number of years ago. So reading white papers and research from them, various webinars. Obviously, as an operator, we touch every single department. So I've ran and built every single department. So I'm not focused on just one topic. So just kind of keeping a pulse on what's going out there, what people are doing, when you're having conversation with people from all different departments, all different types of companies, all different industries, just feeding the knowledge from them about what have you done, what have you seen work, what have you seen not work. I think just kind of being curious and just learning how to learn is really that key point. And there's so much information out there. You can kind of at your desire, pick and choose details. A podcast here, a YouTube video there, a webinar there, a white paper there. Just feed yourself the knowledge and just see like, has it gel? Do you pick up something where you're like, you know what? I can use that in my company later. I can use part of that, or like this person did it this way, but like if I tweak it a little bit, I can use it that way. That's really up to you, right? Your company's not going to feed that information. So if you feed your brain, like a good little, like a bonsai tree there, you can get nice things from it.
Yeah, bonsai tree. There you go. That's a takeaway. It's a slow grow, but it grows. Okay, so the last question I have for you before we close is like, what are the three principles for building durable and scalable revenue operations team?
Mhm. Everyone says scalable. Rarely do they say durable. So that's like extra pressure on that one.
We like
I
pressure. You like
think
pressure.
I think it's all right. If you didn't like pressure, you probably shouldn't be in operations. Um,
Right.
I think you have to start again with the clarity, right? What are you actually doing? What is the purpose of what you're doing? So before you buy the tool, before you go out and figure out I need this $50,000 product, um, what do you want it to do? So clarity would be first for me. The other would be going back to what you said before is what are the signals that you're looking for? What are you aiming to do? So you're not aiming to have a very attractive dashboard. You're aiming to understand something. So what is it that I want to understand? And then you can make the attractive report. And then last, I think I would say, trust. I think getting trust between your team is really key. Um, Going on that people level and being able to have the comfort within your organization to have a conversation, to be open-minded, to make opinions and to work together, and also to admit you're not always correct. When I hire people, I say the best thing you could do is prove me wrong, because that proves that you are engaged in the conversation, you're working and you're bringing out your ideas, and I'm totally okay being wrong. It means we're having a great conversation. So please do it.
I agree 100% with everything you said about those. I think I've learned early in my career that trust is actually saving a lot of money. Um, and having a healthy conversation or confrontation, that's actually enriching you a lot. You learning about somebody else's perspective that you didn't have. So I love every single one of those that you mentioned. All right. I think it's a good point to stop. Um, I really enjoyed the conversation, Joe. Appreciate coming on and sharing your thoughts. Looking forward to have another one soon. Bring you on and then continue. We definitely had a longer list of questions for you that we couldn't ask, so that's probably a good indicator that we should be planning something soon. Thanks. Appreciate
That's
it.
awesome. Thank you both. I love the back and forth. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much.